I thought this was just another rich family story. Until this happened. A woman tied to a tree. A gun pointed at her chest. Hundreds of guests frozen in silence at the most expensive party of the year. And standing in the middle of it all, a billionaire who had to choose, in front of everyone he knew, between the woman he was about to marry and the maid who had quietly held his family together for years. What he did next wasn't just brave. Changed everything. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you won't just remember what happened that night. You'll remember why it happened. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. About power, pride, and the people we overlook until the moment they save us. I promise you, this one will stay with you. Let's get into it. Nobody at the Whitmore estate that night believed the evening would end the way it did. Grace Owens had been folding napkins since 6 in the morning. By the time the sun dipped behind the hedges and the string lights came alive across the lawn, her feet ached, her back ached, and her hands smelled like polish and lemon oil. But none of that mattered. Tonight was important. Tonight was Alexander's engagement party, and Grace had worked in the Whitmore household long enough to know that when the family said important, they meant it in a way most people never had to understand. She was 34 years old, a single mother, and for 6 years she had been the quiet backbone of a house that ran on appearances. She ironed the tablecloths no one would remember. She learned which guests liked their coffee black and which ones lied about liking champagne. She remembered birthdays the family forgot. And in a house full of wealth, she was in many ways invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant she could clock out, drive home to her small apartment, and kiss her 6-year-old daughter Lily goodnight without the chaos of that world following her through the door. Alexander Whitmore, 34, was the heir to one of the largest shipping empires on the East Coast. He'd inherited more money than he could count before he'd even learned to drive, but somehow, he hadn't inherited the coldness that usually came with it. Grace had noticed that about him early on. The way he thanked the kitchen staff by name. The way he once sat with her in the pantry for 20 minutes just to ask about Lily's first day of kindergarten. He wasn't like the other men in his family. He noticed people. Which was exactly why what happened next felt so impossible to believe. His fiancée, Victoria Lang, 30 years old and stunning in the way magazine covers are stunning, had never once learned Grace's name in the 8 months she'd been engaged to Alexander. To Victoria, Grace was furniture. Useful furniture, but furniture all the same. And from the very first week Victoria moved into the estate, something about Grace unsettled her, though Grace couldn't understand why. Maybe it was the way Alexander's mother, before she passed, had once called Grace, the only honest person left in this house. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Victoria simply couldn't stand sharing attention with anyone, staff or otherwise. That night, 300 guests filled the lawn behind the estate. A live quartet played near the fountain. Waiters moved between tables balancing trays of champagne. Somewhere near the back, Grace adjusted the flowers on table 12, unaware that in less than 2 hours, she would be the reason every camera in that garden turned in one direction. Because somewhere inside that house something had gone missing. And by the time anyone noticed, the blame had already found its way to the person with the least power in the room. By 9 o'clock, the party was at its peak. Grace had just returned to the kitchen to grab a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres when she heard raised voices coming from the east wing. She didn't think much of it. Arguments happened in houses like this, quiet ones behind closed doors that stayed behind closed doors. But this one wasn't quiet, and it wasn't staying anywhere. Victoria Lang stormed into the hallway, her face pale beneath her makeup, her hands trembling in a way Grace had never seen from her before. "It's gone," she kept repeating to no one and everyone. "It's actually gone." It turned out to be a diamond bracelet, a family heirloom that had belonged to Alexander's late mother, one of the few pieces of jewelry from her that Alexander had promised to give Victoria on their wedding day. It had been sitting in a velvet box on the dresser in the private suite less than an hour earlier. Now the box was empty. Security was called quietly at first. Alexander, trying to keep the party calm, assured his fiancée they would find it before anyone noticed anything was wrong. But Victoria wasn't interested in quiet. She wanted someone to blame, and in her mind the answer was obvious. "Who's been in and out of that room today?" she demanded of the household manager. The manager, nervous and eager to please, rattled off a short list of staff who had access to the private wing that day. Grace's name was on it. She'd been in earlier to deliver freshly pressed linens, exactly as she did every week. It was enough for Victoria. She found Grace near the dessert table 20 minutes later, in front of at least a dozen guests. "You," she said, loud enough for heads to turn. "You were in my room today." Grace, startled, straightened immediately. "Yes, ma'am, I brought the linens like I always. My bracelet is missing." The words hung in the air like a slap. Grace felt her stomach drop, not from guilt, but from the sudden, sickening realization of what was happening. She had seen this before, in other houses, with other families. The moment when something goes wrong and the person with the least power becomes the easiest explanation. "I didn't touch anything but the linens," Grace said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady, aware now that more guests were watching. "I would never." "That's what they all say," Victoria snapped. Alexander arrived just as his fiancée's voice rose again, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Grace's. There was something there, not suspicion but worry. Worry for her. He didn't yet know how far the night was about to go. What happened over the next 20 minutes would later be described by more than one guest as the moment the party turned into something out of a nightmare. Victoria, humiliated in front of her own engagement party and desperate to reclaim control of a night that felt like it was slipping away from her, made a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. She grabbed Grace by the wrist. "You're not leaving until I get my bracelet back," she said, her voice shaking with something between fury and panic. Grace tried to pull away, more startled than afraid at first. "Ms. Lang, please, I didn't take anything. You can search me, you can search my locker. Someone hold her," Victoria snapped at the two security guards standing near the tent entrance. What came next happened so fast that even the guests standing closest couldn't quite believe it in the moment. One of the groundskeepers, trying to defuse things, brought over a length of rope typically used for the garden's decorative trellises. Somehow, in the chaos and Victoria's escalating panic, it ended up around Grace's wrists, then her body, binding her to the old oak tree at the edge of the reception lawn, the same tree Alexander's mother used to sit under every summer. "Ms. Lang, this isn't necessary," one of the staff tried to say. But Victoria wasn't listening anymore. Something had cracked in her. The fear of losing a piece of jewelry twisted into something far uglier, a need to be believed, to be right, to punish someone, anyone, for the humiliation of her missing heirloom in front of 300 guests. Then, from inside her small clutch purse, she pulled out something no one at that party expected to see that night. A handgun, licensed and registered to her father, the kind wealthy families sometimes carried for protection and never expected to actually use. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone screamed. Phones came up, recording without thinking. The quartet near the fountain stopped playing mid-note. "Where is my bracelet?" Victoria shouted, raising the gun toward Grace, who sat tied against the tree, her chest heaving, tears streaking down a face that had, until an hour earlier, simply been trying to get through another long shift. "I don't have it," Grace said, her voice trembling but clear. "I have never stolen anything in my life. Please. I have a daughter." Victoria's hand didn't lower. And that was the exact moment Alexander Whitmore came around the corner of the tent and stopped cold. For a full 3 seconds, Alexander didn't move. Later, when he tried to describe that moment to people who asked, he said it felt like the entire world had gone silent except for the sound of his own heartbeat. his fiancée, a gun. The woman who had spent 6 years quietly holding his family together, tied to his mother's favorite tree, crying, pleading for her life over a piece of jewelry. Victoria! His voice cut through the garden, low and steady in a way none of the guests had ever heard from him. Put it down. She stole from us, Alexander, Victoria said, not lowering the weapon. She was in our room. She's the only one who. Put it down, he repeated, stepping slowly between his fiancée and Grace. His hands raised. His eyes locked on Victoria's. Right now. For a moment nothing happened. 300 guests stood frozen. Somewhere near the back, someone was already on the phone with the police. Grace, still bound to the tree, kept her eyes on Alexander, too afraid to speak, too afraid to breathe. Then Victoria's hand began to shake, and slowly the gun lowered. Alexander didn't wait. He crossed the last few feet in 2 strides, kneeling beside Grace, untying the ropes with hands that weren't nearly as steady as his voice had been. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying over and over as the rope fell away. "I'm so sorry, Grace, I'm so sorry." It was the next part that no one, including Victoria, saw coming. Alexander stood, turned to face the crowd. His family's closest friends, business partners, half the city's social elite standing in stunned silence around him, and he didn't try to smooth things over. He didn't whisper an apology and usher everyone back to their seats. He did something far more dangerous to a woman like Victoria. He told the truth. "Grace didn't take anything," he said, loud enough for every guest to hear, "because I know exactly where that bracelet is. I moved it myself this morning to have the clasp repaired before the wedding. It's at Bennington Jewelers on 5th Avenue right now. I forgot to tell you, Victoria, because I was going to surprise you with it fixed." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one belonged entirely to Victoria. The color drained from Victoria's face. "That's not," she started, then stopped, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. She had pulled a gun on an innocent woman, tied her to a tree in front of the entire guest list of their engagement party, over a bracelet that had never even been missing. Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What he said next was quieter, but it landed harder than anything shouted could have. "You didn't even ask me first. You didn't wait 5 minutes to check. You looked at the person with the least power in this house, and you decided she was guilty before you even considered anyone else." "Alexander," I panicked. "You pointed a gun at her, Victoria." His voice cracked slightly, not from anger now, but from something closer to grief. Grief for the person he thought he was going to marry. "She has a 6-year-old daughter. Do you understand what you almost did tonight?" Grace, still catching her breath near the base of the tree, watched the scene unfold with a strange, disorienting numbness. Guests were staring at her now, not with suspicion but with something closer to horror and sympathy, several of them already whispering to each other about what they'd witnessed. A young server, barely 20, had crouched beside her with a glass of water, her hands still trembling as she offered it. "I'm okay," Grace whispered, though she wasn't sure that was true. "I just want to go home." But Alexander wasn't finished. He turned back to Victoria one last time, and in front of everyone, the caterers, the guests, the photographers who had been hired to capture the happiest night of his life, he slid the engagement ring from his own pocket, the one he'd been planning to formally present that evening, and placed it on the table beside her. "I can't marry someone who sees people like Grace as disposable," he said. "I'm sorry. It's over." Gasps rippled through the crowd for the second time that night, though this time no one screamed. A few guests even began, quietly, to clap. Victoria stood frozen, humiliation and disbelief warring across her face, as security, the same security who had, minutes earlier, helped tie Grace to a tree, now gently escorted her toward the front of the estate. Alexander didn't watch her go. He turned instead to Grace, kneeling down beside her once more. "Let me take you home," he said. "You and Lily. Tonight." The drive to Grace's apartment was quiet. Alexander insisted on driving her himself, despite Grace's protests that she could call a cab, that he had 100 guests still standing in his backyard needing answers. "They can wait," he said simply. "You can't." Grace sat in the passenger seat of his car, still shaking slightly, the rope marks faintly visible on her wrists. She stared out the window at the city lights blurring past, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single hour. An hour ago she'd been folding napkins. Now she'd narrowly avoided being shot by the woman who was supposed to become the new lady of the house. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "End things with her, in front of everyone like that." Alexander kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. "Yes, I did. People will talk. It'll be everywhere by morning. Let them talk." He glanced at her briefly. "Grace, you almost died tonight because of a bracelet that was never even missing. If I go back to that party and smooth things over, if I let this become something we quietly move past, then I'm no better than the people who looked away tonight and did nothing." Grace didn't answer right away. In 6 years working in that house, she had learned not to expect much from the people she worked for. Kindness sometimes. Respect rarely. But never this. Never a man willing to burn down his own engagement, in front of everyone who mattered to his social standing, to defend a maid. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Anything. Why did you even come looking for me? You were inside dealing with the party. You didn't have to." Alexander was quiet for a moment, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Because my mother used to say something to me before she passed. She said the way you treat the people who can't do anything for you is the only honest measure of who you really are." He paused. "She used to say you were the only person in that house who never once tried to impress her. That you just showed up every day, did the work, took care of Lily on your own. She respected that more than she respected half the people at that party tonight." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I didn't know she talked about me." "She did. Often." They pulled up outside Grace's small apartment building a few minutes later. Lily's babysitter, an older neighbor named Dolores, was waiting on the front steps, worry etched across her face after Grace's frantic phone call earlier. Grace turned to Alexander before getting out of the car. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me. Not many people in that world do." Alexander held her gaze. "That's going to change. Starting tomorrow." Grace didn't fully understand what he meant until 3 days later. The story had, exactly as Alexander predicted, spread through the city like wildfire. A guest's video of the confrontation, the ropes, the gun, Alexander's public confrontation with Victoria, had been uploaded within hours and had already been viewed millions of times by the following morning. News outlets picked it up. Alexander Whitmore, heir to one of the wealthiest shipping families on the East Coast, canceling his engagement live in front of 300 guests to defend a household staff member, was, without question, the story of the season. But Grace wasn't interested in headlines. She went back to work 2 days later, quietly, hoping to slip back into her normal routine of invisibility. She needed the job. She needed Lily to have stability. The last thing she wanted was to become a symbol of anything. Alexander had other plans. He found her in the kitchen on her 3rd morning back, arranging breakfast trays as she had done 1,000 times before. "Can we talk?" he asked. Grace set down the tray, bracing herself. "Mr. Whitmore, if this is about the video, I never wanted any of this attention. I just want to keep doing my job and—" "I want to pay for Lily's education," he said, cutting gently through her nervous explanation. "All of it. From now through college. And I want to set up a trust in your name. Not charity, Grace, compensation. For 6 years of work this family never properly valued. And for what happened to you at that party, which should never have happened to anyone, let alone in my own home." Grace opened her mouth to protest, the way she always protested anything that felt like too much, but Alexander held up a hand gently. "Please. Let me do this. Not out of guilt. Out of respect." He paused. My mother saw something in you a long time ago that the rest of us were too blind or too comfortable to notice. I don't want to make that same mistake." Grace felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. The sensation of finally being seen fully after years of being background noise in other people's important lives. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." But the story, it turned out, wasn't finished yet. A week later, Victoria resurfaced. Not to apologize, but to fight back. Facing public humiliation and the collapse of her engagement to one of the city's most eligible bachelors, Victoria had hired a lawyer and attempted to spin the story in her favor, claiming she had acted in the heat of the moment out of genuine fear of theft, and that Alexander's public response had been an overreaction designed to embarrass her. She gave a tearful television interview, painting herself as the real victim of the night. For a few days, public opinion wavered, the way it sometimes does when someone with resources and a good lawyer speaks confidently enough. Then Alexander did something Grace hadn't expected. He didn't fight Victoria's narrative with lawyers or press statements. Instead, he asked Grace one simple question. "Would you be willing to tell your side in your own words? Only if you want to. No pressure, no obligation." Grace thought about it for 2 days. She thought about Lily, about the years of invisibility, about every time she'd swallowed her dignity to keep a paycheck coming. And then she said yes. Not for revenge, but because she was tired of letting people who had never earned the right speak over her own story. She sat for a short, quiet interview, no makeup, no styling, just Grace in her own words, describing what it felt like to be tied to a tree over jewelry that had never even been missing, describing what it felt like to look down the barrel of a gun and think of her daughter's face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It was simply honest. And it changed everything. The public conversation shifted overnight, not because of outrage alone, but because people finally understood the full weight of what had happened. Not a misunderstanding at a party, but a woman with power turning a weapon on someone who had none. Victoria's interview, once sympathetic, now looked exactly like what it was. Within a month, Victoria had quietly moved out of the city altogether. Her name fading from both headlines and Alexander's life for good. 6 months passed. Grace no longer worked as a maid at the Whitmore estate. Not because she was pushed out, but because Alexander, true to his word, had helped her open something she never imagined she'd have the means to build. A small but growing home cleaning business of her own, staffed by women from her old neighborhood who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated and overlooked. Lily started first grade that fall in a new school, in a new neighborhood, with a college fund quietly growing in her name that she wouldn't fully understand the significance of for years. Alexander visited sometimes, not as her employer anymore, but as something that had slowly, carefully, become a genuine friendship neither of them had expected. He never rushed anything. He simply showed up, the way Grace once had, day after day, proving through consistency what words alone couldn't. One afternoon, sitting on the small porch of Grace's new apartment while Lily chased fireflies in the yard, Alexander finally said the thing he'd been circling for months. "I used to think the people who mattered most were the ones everyone noticed," he said. "The guests, the partners, the people at the top of the table. My mother tried to tell me otherwise for years, and I didn't really understand what she meant until that night at the party." Grace watched Lily's laughter drift across the yard. "What do you understand now? That the measure of a person isn't how they treat the people who can help them," Alexander said quietly. "It's how they treat the people who can't." There's a version of that night that could have ended very differently. If Alexander hadn't walked around that corner at exactly the right moment. If he had chosen his fiancée's comfort over an inconvenient truth. If he had quietly smoothed things over the way so many people in his position might have, to protect appearances, to protect the wedding, to protect a life that looked perfect from the outside. But he didn't. And because he didn't, a woman who had spent 6 years being invisible finally had a chance to be seen, not just by the man who changed her life that night, but by an entire audience of strangers who, for one brief moment, were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. That dignity has nothing to do with what someone owns or wears or how much power they hold in a room. It has everything to do with how they're treated when they have none of their own. Grace Owens didn't ask to become a symbol of anything. She simply showed up every single day, and did the work with quiet integrity, long before anyone was watching. And when the cameras finally did turn her way, it wasn't because she'd changed. It was because someone had finally chosen to look. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we tell them. Because somewhere out there, someone is being overlooked right now, doing everything right, waiting for someone to simply notice. Be that person. Notice someone today. If you felt something watching this, hit like. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters, even when no one's watching. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.